you've taken your fiddle and your bow out of the case. I want to talk about these things really fast, and it's important to be familiar with the parts of the instrument. I will be referring to them often in the lessons. So starting from top to bottom of the fiddle or the violin, a very common question, they are the same instrument. There can be subtle differences in setup of bridge and things, but they really are the same instrument. I, in fact, use this very instrument for many, many styles, including classical and fiddle. So at the top, we have the scroll. I remember it looks kind of like a cinnamon roll scroll. These guys are the pegs, P-E-G-S, and they're friction pegs. So this can be a little difficult at first to get used to using, but we'll cover that here in a second. So they go into what's called the peg box here. And then it's a very small but very important piece of the violin. This little tiny thing that sticks up is called the nut. And so that elevates the strings just a little bit so they can vibrate freely without touching. Continuing on to the fingerboard. Those are both typically made out of ebony. And then the fingerboard is connected to the neck. And the neck is going to be the best way to hold your instrument pretty much at all times for safety and to protect the wood and such. And then, of course, the strings that go over the fingerboard are connected to the pegs, and they go all the way up here over what's called the bridge. And this is freestanding. It's not glued to the instrument. This is going to be the most delicate part of your instrument. So make sure you're never putting it on its face. That would be very rude. And making sure there's just no pressure. So you want to be very careful with the instrument. And then it connects to what's called a tailpiece. And then if you follow the tailpiece around, it's connected to a button, which is about that long, and it just sticks in. Also not glued. So they're really incredible instruments held together by kind of tension. And the body of the instrument is this whole thing. You have the back and the front. Inside of the instrument, you can see a sound post that sticks up, also not glued in there. So if you do drop your fiddle or even the fiddle in the case, sometimes that can fall over. So another reason to be very careful with these instruments. I generally tell people treat them as if it's a pet, an animal. You wouldn't want to leave it in the hot or cold car for too long. When you're in your house, try not to put it next to a cold window or a heater. So they are very sensitive to temperature, pressure, and humidity changes. And then just a couple more pieces. This is the chin rest. And these are the F holes. So it's hollow, and that's where the sound is going to come out. Now, moving on to the bow, spelled B-O-W, we have the tip, and that's part of the stick is what we call it. Typically made out of Pernambuco, but there's a lot of great synthetic bows out there. We've got the grip right here, usually made out of some sort of leather. Continuing on, this is the screw, and we want to make sure every time you are not playing your fiddle, you want to get into the habit of loosening your bow. So you do that with the screw here, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. So I usually loosen it to about the point where you can see that the hairs are kind of fuzzy there. And then when I tighten it, righty-tighty, this is personal preference, but about the amount where you could put a pinky or a pencil through the center. And you want to make sure not to touch. This is the hair. It's made from horsehair. And the reason you don't want to touch it is we put rosin on our bows, and I'll talk about that in a second. And you can actually strip the rosin off accidentally with the oils from your fingers. So you might be playing along and you have a note and then it's silent for a split second. And so that's why you generally don't want to touch the hair. And then the last bit that's very important is the frog. And the frog is a separate thing that actually it detaches if you loosen the screw all the way. So both of these things are made typically by hand, and they're works of art. So make sure you take the proper time and care. So speaking of time and care, you might want to clean your instruments every time you put them away. I use just a nice microfiber cloth, wiping off the strings, getting some of the rosin off, the dust, and the back perhaps. And then for the bow, also can be easily neglected. You want to kind of pinch the stick there with your cloth and run it up and down while your bow's tightened so it's not rubbing against the hairs. So that concludes the parts of the bow and fiddle.